Greetings. The last time the Holy Family went home from Egypt to Nazareth. Now this time we're going to John the Baptist and his adventures as a kid growing up in the desert. So subtext, John as a child growing up in the desert. John had already been long in the desert before the Holy Family's return from Egypt. That he had retired there at so young an age was due principally to divine inspiration and partly to his own inclinations, for he was of a meditative nature and loved solitude. He was never in a school. The Holy Spirit himself taught him in the desert. He was much talked of even from his childhood, for the wonders attendant on his birth were known, and a light was often seen around the child. Herod soon laid snares for him, and even before the children's massacre, Elizabeth was obliged to flee with him into the desert. He could walk and help himself at the same time. He took refuge not far from the first cave of Magdalene, and Elizabeth visited him sometimes. When in his 6th or 7th year, I saw him again led into the desert by his mother. When Elizabeth left the house with the boy, Zechariah was not home. He loved John so much, and his grief at losing him was so great that he was obliged to absent himself in order not to witness his departure. He had, however, given him his blessing, for he was in the habit of blessing both mother and child whenever he left home. John wore a garment of skin. It passed from left to right, over the shoulder and breast, was fastened under the right arm, and hung around behind. This was his only garment. His hair was brownish and darker than that of Jesus. He bore in his hand a white staff, which he had brought with him from home, which he always kept in the desert. I saw him, as just described, hastening across the country by the hands of his mother. Elizabeth was a tall, active old woman with a small, delicate face, and she was completely enveloped in a large mantle. John often ran on before her, hopping and jumping, perfectly unrestrained and childlike in action, though not distracted in soul. I saw them crossing a river. There was no bridge at that point, and so they crossed on a raft that was floating on the water. Elizabeth was a very resolute person. No difficulty daunted her. She herself rowed the raft across, using for that purpose the branch of a tree. They now turned eastward and entered a ravine, rocky and desolate above, but lower down covered with bushes and overgrown with strawberries. John now and then ate one. After going some distance into the ravine, Elizabeth took leave of John. She blessed him, pressed him to her heart, kissed him on the cheeks and forehead, and turned away, looking back at him as she retraced her steps, weeping. But the boy appeared wholly unconcerned, and quietly walked on deeper into the ravine. I followed the child with a feeling of uneasiness at his going so far from his mother, and fearing that he would not be able to find his way home again. But just then a voice said to me, "Be not uneasy. The child knows well what he is about." I went with him and, in several visions, saw his whole afterlife in the desert. He often told me after himself how he denied himself in every way and mortified his senses, his understanding becoming clearer and clearer, learning in an unexplainable way something from everything around him. I saw him when a child playing with flowers and animals. The birds were particularly familiar with him. They lighted upon his head when he was walking or praying, and perched upon his staff when he laid it across the branches. There they sat in numbers while he watched them and played with them. I saw him also going after other animals, following them into their dens, feeding them, playing with them, or earnestly watching them. At the opposite extremity of this rocky ravine, the country was somewhat more wide open. John pressed on until he reached a little lake, with a low shore covered with white sand. I saw him there wading far out into the water. The fish swam up and gathered around him. He seemed quite at home with them. He lived in this region a long time, and I saw that he wove for himself out of branches a sleeping hut among the bushes. It was very low and only large enough to allow him to lie in it. Both here and afterward in other places, I often saw by him radiant figures, angels, with whom he treated fearlessly and confidently, though most reverently. They appeared to be teaching him, directing his attention to different things. He had fastened a piece of wood to his staff, thus giving it the form of a cross. Also, a strip of broad grass or bark or leaves like a little flag. He often played with it, waving it here and there. While he lived in this part of the desert, I saw his mother visiting him twice, but they did not meet at this spot. He must have known when she was coming, for he always went out some distance to meet her. Elizabeth brought him a tablet with a slender reed for writing. After his father's death, John went secretly to Jutta to console Elizabeth. He remained concealed with her for some time. She told him many things of Jesus and the Holy Family, some of which he noted down with strokes on his tablet. Elizabeth wanted him to go with her to Nazareth, but he would not. He returned again to the desert. Once, when Zechariah had gone with a herd to the temple, he was set upon by Herod's soldiers and rudely maltreated in a narrow pass on the side of Jerusalem nearest to Bethlehem, at a spot whence the city could not be seen. The soldiers dragged him into a prison on that side of Mount Zion, by which, at a later period, the disciples used to ascend. Zechariah was frightfully maltreated, tortured, and at last pierced with a sword because he would not disclose John's retreat. Elizabeth was at the time in the desert with John. When she returned to Jutta, he accompanied her part of the way and then went back into the desert. On reaching Jutta, Elizabeth learned of the murder of her husband, and great were her lamentations. Zechariah was buried by his friends in the vicinity of the temple. He is not that Zechariah who was slain between the altar and the temple, and whom I saw at the time of the crucifixion with the other risen dead. He issued from that part of the wall in which the aged Simeon once had his cell for prayer, and walked about the temple. The last Zechariah was murdered in a struggle that had taken place among many at the temple concerning the genealogy of the Messiah and certain privileges and places of the individual families. Elizabeth's sorrow was so great that she could no longer bear to remain in Jutta without John. Consequently, she returned to him in the desert. She soon after died there and was buried by an Essene, a relative of Anne the prophetess. The house in Jutta, a very handsomely ordered one, was occupied by her sister's daughter. John secretly returned to it once after his mother's death, after which he buried himself still deeper in the desert, and thenceforth was altogether alone. I saw him journeying to the south around the Dead Sea, then up the eastern side of the Jordan, from wilderness to wilderness, towards Kedar, and even towards Gesur. When he passed from one wilderness to another, I saw him running through broad fields by night. He went to that region where long after I saw John the evangelist sitting and writing under the high trees. Under those trees grew bushes with berries, of which he sometimes ate. I saw him also eating a certain herb that bears a white flower and has 5 round leaves like clover. We have at home herbs like them, only smaller. They grow under the hedges, and the leaves have a sourish taste. When I was a child, I used to love to chew them while minding the cattle off in the solitary fields because I had seen John eating them. I also saw him drawing forth from holes in the trees and picking out of moss on the ground lumps of some brownish-looking stuff which he ate. I think it was wild honey, for it was very plentiful there. The skin that he had brought with him from home he now wore around his loins, and over his shoulders hung a brown shaggy cover which he had woven himself. There were in the desert wool-bearing animals which ran tamely around John, and camels with long hair on their neck. They stood most patiently and allowed him to pull it out. I saw him twisting the hair into cords and weaving from them that covering which he wore hanging around him when he appeared among men and baptized. I saw him in continual and familiar communication with angels, by whom he was instructed. He slept upon the hard rock and under the open sky, ran over rough stones, through thorns and briars, disciplined himself with thistles, wore himself out working on trees and stones, and lay prostrate in prayer and contemplation. He leveled roads, made little bridges, and changed the course of well springs. I often saw him writing in the sand with a reed, kneeling and standing motionless in ecstasy, or praying with outstretched arms. His penance and mortification became more and more severe, his prayer longer and more fervent. He saw the Savior only 3 times face to face with his bodily eyes, but Jesus was with him in spirit, and John, who was constantly in the prophetic state, saw in spirit the actions of Jesus. I saw John when full grown. He was a powerful, earnest man. He was standing in a dry well in the desert and appeared to be in prayer. A light hovered over him like a cloud, and it seemed to me as if it came from on high, from the water above the earth. Then a light, shining stream fell over him into the basin below. While gazing on this torrent, I saw John no longer at the edge of the basin. He was in it, the shining water flowing over him, and the basin filled by the sparkling stream. Then again I saw him, as at first, standing on the basin's edge, but I did not see him out of it nor coming out. I think that the whole was perhaps a vision which John himself had had, and by which he was instructed to begin to baptize, or it may have been a spiritual baptism bestowed upon him in vision. Subtext: Feast picture of John the Baptist. I saw in the desert in which John dwelt a spiritual church rising up out of the waters that flowed in streams from on high, from paradise, that floated in clouds and welled up in fountains. The church was immeasurably vast. It seemed to be symbolical of baptism, and it grew with the baptized. It was perfectly transparent like crystal. An octagonal tower arose from the interior and reached up far out of sight. Under it was a great fountain like the baptism fountain of John, which he had formed in the desert after a model shown him in the vision. In the tower grew a genealogical tree upon which appeared John and his ancestors. There was also an altar and a wonderful representation of John's conception, birth, circumcision, and life in the desert, of the baptism of Jesus and John's beheading. Far up in the tower, as if on a ladder reaching to heaven, were seen in admirable order the whole host of saints, the entire history of the promise and the redemption, and the abodes of the blessed, endless in number. High above all the rest hovered the Blessed Virgin in a mantle so wide as to cover all. All these representations were white and transparent, and now came immense crowds from all sides, kings and peoples in all kinds of costumes. They looked like nations that were migrating. Many passed by the baptism church and went into the desert, where there is no water of life. Many others entered the church and knelt down by the baptism fountain, by the side of which stood John under the appearance that he presented as a child in the desert. He struck the water with his little staff and sprinkled it over them. And no matter how tall they were on entering the church, all that were thus sprinkled became small, but many only passed in and out of the church. They who had become little ones, like unto those that enter the heavenly kingdom, ascended the high, wonderful tower on the ladder that reached to heaven. There were at the baptism holy godparents. The whole church, which appeared to be a building and still was formed of water, floated on high as if supported by a cord let down from heaven. End of reading. All right, so a few notes here. Just a few. I promise these are helpful, even though they go on too long. First note, in Mystical City, John the Baptist also meditated on the cross just as Our Lady did. It was revealed in Mystical City that the Holy Spirit taught them to do this. The details are mostly the same. John went into the wilderness as a child and spent most of his life there. Now, one thing I'll note. Now they say desert, but wilderness is a more appropriate term. Like we see this term in Apocalypse, in at Apocalypse 12, where the woman who has the two wings of a great eagle is going into the quote-unquote desert, but it's more accurately wilderness. It means it's not quite like dunes. When we think of sand, desert, we think of sands and dunes like the Sahara, like the middle of the Sahara. So we don't distinguish the many, many different types of deserts. Some of them are really much rockier. They're all barren, but there's a degree of barrenness to them. We know deserts as utterly barren, but there's some deserts that are just half barren. You wouldn't want to plant farms there anyway. We humans tend to live around rivers where the electricity is. In the desert, John grew up in the wilderness near the Dead Sea. That the Jordan, it wasn't really verdant like, the country England, but it wasn't just dunes of sand either. It had rivers, streams, ravines, some growth. In general, it was just somewhat barren. So they call it a desert because it was barren. Next note, I see some similarities in Anne Catherine's life and this saint's life. Actually, I see other similarities. I'll get to them later. So Anne Catherine had all these visions that she herself said of her visions that they were more acutely experienced. And reality, the more she had experienced these visions, the more her senses of reality kind of became like everything was passing through a wall. Like it was dull. Where she got these visions extremely clearly. John was cleansed in the womb of original sin, so his proverbial baptism took place then when Elizabeth made her famous statement to Our Lady, "Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb." Therefore, John the Baptist was always a very holy child, very set apart, lived an extraordinary life. I mean, just the locust part. It's like saying, I eat penance for breakfast. We hear of saints and the penances they do, and it's hardcore. But it's what makes saints into what they are. I imagine that when Anne Catherine was following him in vision, she probably felt a kinship with him. Us sinners would just be like, dude, you're eating what? So next, I make fun of Jesus movies for their heresies. But the character they always seem to get the most right is John the Baptist. Prophetic, preaching, bold, wild, yet comforting, because this guy is a soldier. You wouldn't want anyone else at your side fighting demons other than, obviously, the Holy Family. Now, the scenes of him and Jesus in Nazareth are actually really good. But what must we do to become saved? Change our hearts. My ways are not your ways, saith the Lord. That boldness. I love it. The greatest story ever told also did the movie from the late 60s. Had a pretty funny John the Baptist as well. And it was good. Although the bit was pretty comedic and probably did him a little bit of injustice. I always watched a few seasons. Oh, wow. Sorry, I also watched. I mean, I've seen other depictions of John the Baptist, like the Gospel John, the movie, which is it's based on Protestant translation of the Bible, so I don't really recommend it. And then the I don't know if it's a Protestant, but it seems like it's like a marriage between Protestant and Catholic. I prefer the Latin, the Douay Reims. I even have like an international study Catholic edition, but I don't know. Anyways, I watched a few seasons of The Chosen before I couldn't put up with the heresies anymore. And the Baptist, just he feels like a nerd in that. I don't like his portrayal in that one at all. And maybe we were just spoiled, with the greatness of the Baptist and Jesus of Nazareth. Could it be done better? I don't know, maybe, but I think it was executed fantastic in Jesus of Nazareth, the 1977 movie. Anyways, next note. The Bible gave us judges before they gave us kings. And yes, the pun is intended. John feels like the judge before Christ the king. And the baptism feels like the crown, like the coronation. And even now, I'll get into that later, some popes and kings have had that sign where the dove comes from the sky and lands on them. So, in John the Baptist, we're sort of seeing the life of a biblical judge, although we remember that Samson was a judge and probably the most famous one. Now, I just recently read the book of Judges in the last 2 months. I still barely remember it because it's very mysterious. Although, if I start reading one of the chapters, it'll be like, oh yeah, this. But I can't remember it from memory. I remember Samson's story well, but anyways, next point. The other saint, much like John the Baptist, is obviously, there's other saints, but one I call out is Francis of Assisi. Although St. Francis came from higher circumstances, he eventually embraced, well, so did John the Baptist, but the Baptist was thrust into the wilderness early, whereas Francis of Assisi grew up to this. So anyways, Francis actually eventually embraced poverty. Like the Baptist, both sort of forsook this world, and their miserable circumstances say, I renounce this world to God loud and clear. We see someone live like, well, let's see someone live like these people now. I'm typing this on a computer, staring out into a cold winter in my cozy heat-pumped home. Although I sleep in a cold room that is 16.5 degrees, these people probably had frozen feet every night. Sleep. And got maybe 4 to 6 hours if they were lucky. While their body was perennially in fight mode like an adrenaline junkie. St. John the Baptist made friends with angels and animals, and the animals obviously conceded to angels. Now I imagine, and people often talk about the behavior of animals, and they're like, they ascribe to them an intelligence. I'm like, animals aren't that smart. However, angels are. So I imagine angelic and demonic forces have a powerful sway on animals, which is why they make such effective literary tools for writers to express thoughts and ideas. Next note. We see that the synagogue had already a rocky relationship with God's favored ones, and now we get the example of the two Zechariahs here. So Zechariah, John the Baptist's dad, is not to be confused with the Zechariah that was slain between the altar and the high place. I don't remember that. Anyways, this is how we know what's going on is demonic. It's such a simple thing. Father Chad Ripperger terms it as anything but Catholicism nowadays, which I've always known to be true, but to the less discerning person, because I went to university and studied this stuff, so I had that advantage, although it's like being around the roaches to know what the roaches are. So anyways, to the less discerning person who didn't always spot the Marxism in current media, which they finally started to do and calling it wokeism, they're going to start seeing more and more than their beloved streaming services like Netflix, Prime, Crave, are nothing but fronts of demonic indoctrination. TV is now truly turning into Satan's tabernacle and has been for a long time. To contrast it, watch a movie like The Bells of St. Mary, The Song of Bernadette. Consider that these movie types are extinct. Anything that glorifies an orthodox version of Catholicism is not only reviled by the secular world because of the demons that rule it, really hate it, it is also getting similar treatment from the Vatican itself, which is why the quote-unquote extraordinary form of the Mass is under persecution by the Vatican, which also tells us that there are demons here as well. Demons don't like holiness. And it's a tell that whenever someone is killed by state authorities or any authority, and you see a pattern developing, they just happen to be attacking this version of Catholicism, those tends to be the ones that tend to be the ones interrupting the plans of the demons, which they want to go off without a hitch. Well, we know. It's like, who do they hate? That's our friend. So right now, the world is pollinating in nightmare dust. And anyone who is truly woke, they're the ones blowing away the dust. For example, we consider the hysteria of 2021. Well, the ones blowing away the dust, they were the ones persecuted and reviled. You remember the whole fiasco around ivermectin, which is, by the way, still a very powerful remedy to a lot of things. But see that you can't, see that, try to get ivermectin. Try to get your hands on it, and you'll see what I mean. Now, I hope this channel is telling people to wake up. The world is in a state of spiritual crisis, and we need soldiers, saint soldiers like John the Baptist. Live a life full of penance. This is what it is to be a spiritual soldier, to live in penance. Lastly, this saint was a real soldier. I wanted to mention her before the end. Saint Veronica Giuliani. Read her hagiography or watch a good presentation of her on YouTube. Try not to watch biographical depictions of people right away because they don't do them real justice. They don't tell the whole story. They usually use, the problem with this world is they use stories and saints as fronts to say what they want to say. It's just glorified journalism. Whereas when a scholar dedicates their life to a saint and they make a presentation, you're going to get a fantastic expose on the subject. So, and this does it way more justice. For example, St. Francis of Assisi, watch John Veneri's seminar on Francis of Assisi, and you'll realize I never really knew this man. Because the person you hear about on TV is not the same Saint Francis as was in real life, right? So you have to really look up what the dedicated scholars say, and they're doing the Lord's work. Now get a presentation on Saint Veronica Giuliani, and this is a woman who gave constant penance. And then we go to the mystics like Mary Julie Jahenny, who's not even a saint, and Teresa Neumann. They lived years and years on the Holy Eucharist, and they would undergo and Catherine Emmerich was the same. They'd go under these long, torturous sprees of experiencing what Christ did in the crucifixion. I mean, we have to be exposed to these people. We have to know who they are. Anyways, that's it. Ave Maria.